All right. Of course, we're live on YouTube first. YouTube is always just, I guess, a superior. So I'm like testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. Oh boy. Hey, Facebook crowd. As you can imagine, it is actually YouTube that I'm having the difficulties with right now. So let me just double check and make sure that I'm able to be heard. If you can hear me on YouTube, give a thumbs up or just a hello. I'd appreciate it. Clarence Dawson on Facebook, good to see you. Danny Smith, welcome in, welcome in. We will get this up and rolling shortly once I figure out if I have sound or not. Colby Curry, YouTube is good. All right, that is a positive. Let's just double check just to be safe. I'm live. Fantastic. All right, I can hear myself, which is an unfortunate discovery usually, but welcome in everyone. As usual, it's Tuesday. We are here talking Georgia football. Thank you guys on YouTube for letting me know we're all good. We're talking Georgia football. Obviously, there's not a ton going on right now. It's the middle of June, but there's still some stuff to talk about. They are back at practice, or not practice, I should say, voluntary workouts. You're not going to see a whole lot of video coming from them from that aspect just because the NCAA does not allow them to sort of photograph or have in any sort of media, in-house media included, sort of shoot video of these guys working out. So the thing to remember is you're not going to see those like on Twitter or Instagram, as my light falls down. The Georgia football accounts sort of tweet out video of these guys working out, getting ready for the season. That availability is, I believe, expected to start coming up in the middle of July. I think that second week in July, July 13th, I believe. So BA's daddy, welcome in. Good to see you. Mark Brantley on Facebook, good to see you guys. Killian Worthy, good to see you guys. So you're not going to see a whole lot. You might see, some stuff of guys walking around, but if you pay attention to these videos, you will not see them. You will not see Georgia showing them working out in any sort of meaningful fashion. But these guys are back. It is a positive that they are, back, getting ready to work out right now. Jeff Wally, I'll answer this question quickly. Are players able to stay on campus from voluntary workouts right through the coaches coaching, July 13th? Yes, these guys are now essentially all on campus, all working out, all sort of getting ready. Obviously they're not. As my light goes down again, this is just going to be one of those days, isn't it? To answer your question, Jeff, yeah, these guys are all on campus. They can't interact face-to-face with coaches or get sort of any coaching instruction, have like any practices out on the field, but they are able to work with Scott Sinclair, which I can tell you from my own experience. His Instagram and Twitter videos are very helpful and have sort of helped me get in really good shape for the first time in a while. Jeff Sintel, boy, I had some pressure on here with Mr. Sintel watching. So it's about 3 minutes in now. So, and Jeff, Kip, to answer your question, as Jeff just did, yes, George Pickens is on campus. To our knowledge, every member of the Georgia team, that includes the J.B. Newmans, Darnell Washingtons, Kendall Miltons, those incoming freshmen, to our knowledge, all these players are on campus as of right now and, sort of working out, trying to get in shape and ready to go for the upcoming 2020 season. So to start off tonight, we're going to begin talking about Azeez Ojulari. For those who don't know, today is actually his birthday. Dog Nation, check out the Instagram channel, wish him a happy birthday. Some great Jeff Sintel shots of Ojulari in action. And starting with Ojulari last year, hands down, was Georgia's best pass rusher, 5.5 sacks. A guy who, I don't want to say he came out of nowhere. I think if you're plugged into the Georgia football scene or you listen to Dog Nation a lot, you were aware that Azeez was going to be a player for Georgia last season, but I'm not sure anyone expected him to be the best outside linebacker, which I believe he was a season ago, in a room with guys like Adam Anderson, Jermaine Johnson, at the beginning of the year, Brenton Cox, and Nolan Smith as well. And he really made some nice plays, 5.5 sacks, as we said, and a guy who, as a redshirt freshman, second year in the Georgia program, a guy who 2 years, he suffered a serious knee injury in high school, and a guy who really sort of turned the corner and looked like, like a lot of the current Georgia players on the defensive side of the ball, a really good player. Yeah, Josh Bonin hits the nail on the head. He's got a leader written all over him. He was, I believe, a game captain last year. That's a rarity for a second-year player in Kirby Smart's program. And that just sort of shows you what the coaching staff sort of believes in Ojulari. I don't think it's insignificant that Dan Lanning is the defensive coordinator, and Lanning works with Ojulari every day as the outside linebacker coach as well. And they all speak so incredibly highly of Ojulari, both on and off the field. And the reason we bring him up is if there's one – it's not even a knock, but it's one area that we think the Georgia defense could be better this year. It's both rushing the passer and creating negative plays, tackles for loss in the run game. And I think those two things sort of work hand in hand. If you're able to create negative run plays on first and second down, you can force them into third and long passing down situations, which as a sort of edge rusher just sort of makes your job easier in terms of knowing what to expect. And Georgia, I believe they ranked 46th in the country in sacks last year, 60th in tackles for loss. So those numbers aren't great. And even, for defenses like Oklahoma and LSU, which were not great defenses a season ago, they still managed to rank in the top 25 in both sacks and tackles for loss in those two categories. So that is, to me anyway, is an important sort of statistic to look at just in terms of, how much easier are you making things both on your offense and your defense by being able to generate sacks. And, Brandon Adams, we've talked about this a lot. We talked about it a lot last year. The number we sort of throw out, and Desmond, the havoc rate, yes, year over year, Georgia got better in that both statistic and sort of across the board. But it's not where I believe that it sort of needs to be. I believe the number they reach for, I think, is 20%, 15 to 20% havoc rate. And havoc rate is essentially sacks, tackles for loss, turnovers, or sort of deflections. So how does Georgia easily have an easier chance of getting from, I believe they finished last year with 31 sacks. How do they get to 40 or even, 37, 38? How, over the course of, let's just say, a 12-game season, how do they go? How do they sort of add 6 sacks? And some of this can be scheming. Some of this can be sort of a more aggressive, blitz packages, things of that nature. The Georgia defensive line obviously isn't as deep this year, but when you see more playing time from guys like Jordan Davis, guys like Trayvon Walker, that'll help. But if there's one guy I think that specifically we can easily point to in terms of creating more pressures by himself, generating more pressures, getting more sacks, and sort of helping that Georgia pass rush really become more fearsome. And I'm not saying Ojulari is going to become the next Jarvis Jones or David Pollock, but I think the big thing is, can he get from, say, 5.5 sacks to 8.5, 9 sacks? Can he over the course of a 12-game season, can he just get 3 more sacks? That's a half sack every other game, essentially. If he can do that, I think, and he becomes, if you're getting 9 sacks in the SEC, you're certainly an all SEC candidate, maybe even potentially first team when you're playing on a defense as good as Georgia's defense is. If he can do that, if he can make the transition from already being a very good borderline all SEC player to being a bona fide all SEC player, and Desmond Lee, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Azeez has to finish. There are countless examples of him last year where he's getting to the quarterback, he's pressuring the quarterback, he's even getting his hands on the quarterback. But, the difference between the really good pass rushing teams and the truly great pass rushing teams, and I saw somebody here in one of these, Colby Curry, they bring up the NASCAR package that the Giants run, where they're essentially – and Georgia does run something like that where they just put their best pass rushers on the field. Georgia, as a pass rushing unit, just needs to get to a point where they're able to consistently bring the quarterback down and get there right on time. And Antoine Middleton brings up that Baylor game last year. I think that Baylor game is sort of very telling in sort of, I think, what maybe Georgia wants to be going forward. Obviously it was the last game of James Coley, last game of Jake Fromm. You did see them air it out a little bit more. They gave the ball a lot to George Pickens, especially in that first half. But I think defensively in that game, as some people in the Facebook and YouTube comments have picked up on, they were very, I would say, more aggressive. And maybe it's just because it's the last game of the season. You don't really have anything to lose, literally, at that point. Maybe they allow themselves to play a little bit more aggressive. But that Georgia defense that day was knocking around Baylor's quarterbacks. Charlie Brewer actually got knocked out in the game on a hit that I believe was flagged by Trayvon Walker. Is that Baylor game sort of – and he played very well in that Baylor game. I believe he had a sack in that Baylor game. is that Baylor game sort of indicative of what Georgia wants to be going forward, which is admittedly probably perhaps a little bit more of an aggressive sort of front seven. They're willing to take more chances and sort of bring down the play because, again, with the Georgia defense, the most important thing always is just going to be preventing big plays. And you've seen that for the most part, with the exception of the LSU game last year. If you were going to score on the Georgia defense, it was going to be because you were going to have to drive and put together a 10, 11, 12 play drive. And Hugh Nash, welcome in. Good to see you. Frank DiCarlo, good to see you as well. You were going to have to put together 10, 11, 12 plays over the course of a full drive and find a way into the end zone. And while that's great, and for against most teams, you saw against LSU that ultimately you're just, the unfortunate thing, and as a former high school offensive lineman, as you can win, 9 out of 10 snaps or 9 out of 10 reps, but you lose that 10th rep. That's all anyone remembers. And that makes it so much more difficult for your offense. So if Georgia is, and I think Azeez Ojulari specifically, if he makes those reps, if he takes that next step and goes from, again, as we've said, sort of a fringe all-SEC guy, a guy who might be on the all-SEC ballot whenever that comes out in the preseason, to a no doubt about it first teamer guy you have to have on your ballot. I think that, and Desmond Lee brings up in that LSU game very vividly. They had times where they had a hand or two or a hit on Joe Burrow, and Burrow, who, there's a debate about between him and Cam Newton who had the better overall season. I find it hard to go against Burrow. There were examples in that game where Georgia had him sort of pinned, sort of dead to rights, and they just could not bring him down. And if Georgia is able to consistently, it starts, I think, with Azeez Ojulari. I think that if they're able to do that, that just makes this Georgia defense all the more formidable. Because, again, last year they were first in the country in scoring defense, first in rushing defense. Jeff Sintel with a great stat is he's had 34.5 quarterback pressures last year, but he only had 5.5 sacks. So off the top of my head, that's roughly 1 in every 7, 6.5 pressures he's turning into a sack. And obviously the thing to know about with pressures is you want those to be high, because eventually you're just sort of getting more bites at the apple, and you want a consistently high pressure rate. You look at someone like Vic Beasley, when he led the Falcons in sacks in, I believe, 2016, he had an unusually low sort of pressure rate in that most of his pressures actually ended up in sacks. So it's not the end of the world that Ojulari's is what it is there. But you do need to sort of do a better job, I think, of turning some of those pressures, not all of them, but, over the course of a year, can you turn 2 or 3 of those, what were a year ago pressures, hits, knockdowns, can you turn those into outright sacks? I think you look at the Florida game, there were a couple of Florida drives in there where, they got a first down or two, but then there was a big sack. I know Jordan Davis had one, and I believe Ojulari had one as well in that game. And you look at those sacks, those just absolutely killed those drives. And I think that's something this year where you go that next step. If you're getting more sacks, you're forcing the other team to punt more. You are giving your offense more bites at the apple, and Georgia is going to need on that offensive side of the ball as many bites as the apple as they can. I saw a good comment on here. Rodney Hewitt, again, loves Azeez, but Nolan and Trayvon need to take the next step. Their ceilings are as high as anyone in the entire country. I certainly agree with you on Trayvon Walker there. And the interesting thing is that, Trayvon and Nolan Smith, I don't want to say they have guys in front of them blocking, but blocking sort of them from, playing all the time. But the guys in front of them, Malik Herring and Azeez Ojulari, are really, really good players. And the reality is this Georgia defense is sort of stacked with really good players. And so I think you're not – this season, because of the presence of Herring and Azeez Ojulari, you're not going to see Nolan Smith sort of become that 10-sack player. You're not going to see Trayvon Walker become a guy that gets talked as a top 5 draft pick, I think. But as you bring up, Rodney, those guys have ceilings as high as anyone on this Georgia team. And those guys, I mentioned Azeez. Can he go from 5.5 to 8.5, 9 sacks? With Nolan, can he go from 2.5 to 5.5 sacks? Can he play that DeAndre Walker type role in 2017 where, yes, he had Lorenzo Carter and Davin Bellamy in front of him, but Walker still, because he was such a very good pass rusher, and I think Walker is one of the more underrated players to come through the Georgia program in the last decade. I think if Nolan can make that sort of DeAndre Walker type leap where he is a feared pass rusher when he comes in the game and teams sort of have to be aware of him when he is on the field, I think that is, I think, a very big key for him this coming season. So Philip Jordan Wells, welcome in. Good to see you guys. I saw questions, comments, we'll ask away. I got another sort of monologue, lengthy bit to sort of transition to, and it's actually a question that I have for you guys that sort of it stems from. There's one question. Yeah, Jeff brings up that Tennessee game, that second half, that defense. Azeez over the course of the game had 10 quarterback pressures, and for everyone hyping up, I think the Tennessee offensive line, well, yes, they had 5-star talent last year and they added in a guy like Cade Mays. They were not a great offensive line a year ago. Now, those guys are obviously probably going to get better, but just because you see 5-star talent does not always necessarily equate to having a great offensive line. It would not surprise me in the slightest if come the end of the year, Georgia actually ends up having a better offensive line than Tennessee does, even though Tennessee has Dennis Wilson. Dennis, it's been so long since I've heard from you. Yeah, he brings up Romello Brinson. I don't know if I thought that Georgia was going to come and land him. He's a good player. Miami picked up a good player. But Dennis Wilson, it's been a while. Good to see you. Welcome in. Let's see. Questions, comments. Mike Mizell, good to see you. How big is Azeez? I believe he's around 235, 240 in that range. That's ideally where Georgia kind of likes their pass rushers, being between that 235 and 245 sort of range. We haven't gotten official measurements yet. We'll probably get those around whenever SEC Media Days come out. But look for him to sort of be in that range, a guy who is big enough, I think, to sort of hold his own on the edge in run-stopping situations, because that's the reason I think more than anything else that Azeez got in the field so early last year is that he was very, very good as a outside linebacker, sort of edge defender against the run. And you also want them potentially to be able to good enough to cover, because that's what NFL teams are looking for nowadays, are outside linebackers who are not just able to rush the passer and stop the run, but even if when called upon, drop back into coverage. So Antoine Middleton, do you think Walter Grant takes a back seat this year? Back seat, I don't know how I define it. I think if this Georgia defense is to reach its ultimate ceiling, I think it's with Jermaine Johnson at that same position, which is where Grant has sort of occupied the last couple of seasons. Because the reality is Johnson is just one of, if not the most truly athletic players on the team. Zenti Allen has Adam Anderson gain weight. With that question, one, it's sort of like expecting Demetrius Robertson to sort of break out and become the guy we all thought he was going to be. Ultimately, I think Adam sort of is what he is from a weight standpoint. But you look last year in that LSU game and in the Baylor games, I think Georgia sort of finally figured out a role for him as sort of a designated pass rusher on those third down situations, to where he can come in and really excel and play to his strengths. I don't know if Adam's ever going to be an every down linebacker, but he's a guy who can definitely play a role and be a very good player for Georgia this year. And someone who I think, in certain games, I think Alabama, I think Florida, who I think Florida is going to be a very pass-heavy team. I think in games like that, you're going to see a lot from Anderson. Jacob O'Neill, what up? Good to see you. Yeah, and then ultimately, if Georgia gets into the college football playoff, Clemson, Ohio State, those are teams that are going to want to throw the ball around. And Adam Anderson, I think, is going to be huge in that game. So, talking a little about defense here, Azeez Ojulari, his birthday today. Talking about the various outside linebackers, sack numbers, and all that. So how big is Nolan Smith? Nolan Smith is in that sort of similar range of around, right now he's probably 235, 240, can get up to 250 if need be. Justin Tell with a fact check here. Is he 6'3", and a quarter, 245 to 250 this fall? That's about where I would expect Nolan to end up. Nolan's, I think, a little bit short. I think he's listed at 6'2", but I'm sure Jeff will come in and correct me on that one. So sort of a follow-up question, and I'll maybe talk about this or write about this at some point. If you could get, and I need you guys to sort of help me answer this, but if you could get what we saw on the offensive side of the ball in that 2017 team, where Jake Fromm really was a little limited, especially early in the year as a passer, but Georgia had a very stout and capable run game throughout the year. If you get that version of the Georgia offense for this upcoming season, would you take it / be satisfied? Because there are sort of two schools of thought here. One, I think while there probably won't be a player as good as Roquan Smith, I think there's a very good chance this defense ends up being the best one that Kirby Smart has had. And if Georgia is able to get what it got out of the offense in 2017, it is more than capable of beating Alabama at Alabama, beating Florida and Jacksonville, beating Alabama, LSU, Auburn, whoever they play in Atlanta, and getting to the playoff and making a sort of deep run there. So, if Georgia gets that version of the offense, I think that's a good season at the very least, and sort of paired with this defense, something that they can win a lot of games and do sort of the things that people want them to do. Yes, Eric, the post-Cheney meeting that Nick and Sony had, that meeting took place in 2016, I believe. But sort of the one you saw in 2017 where you had Jake Fromm taking the occasional deep shot every play, but it was certainly not this dynamic, toss it around, throw it around a whole lot. Conversely, if you want, and I'm not saying necessarily better, but something that looks different, that is, I think, more of perhaps what we're going to see from Todd Monken, sort of an air it out. Not exactly. Well, yes, he did work with Mike Gundy and sort of comes from that Oklahoma State line. I would not necessarily label him in just a straight air raid or perhaps in the air raid that we traditionally think of. He's a much more of a vertical passing game and wants to employ that, take deep shots, which I think both plays into what Jamie Newman and JT Daniels can possibly bring and what I think George Pickens excels at as well. So, could you take that? And Desmond Lee asked 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns for Zamir White. That's a very good season for Zamir. I would probably think if Zamir has a season, and we talked about this on Dog Nation Daily today, Mike Mizell brings up, I think 1,200 would be sort of the yardage total that you are looking for from Zamir here. But to sort of converse with the offense, if the offense looks like it did in 2017, the national media conversation around Kirby Smart and sort of this Georgia program is just going to be unbearable. I think, and I'll have something on this on Thursday, sort of comparing Georgia and Oklahoma. And the reality is with Georgia, I just think a lot of people, yes, Georgia fans, but I think they're perhaps maybe a little bit more forgiving if the offense is just competent and capable, which it was not, especially in the month of November last year. But, people want to see him play like Clemson. They want to see him play like Ohio State. And that's certainly understandable. But you do make some sacrifices playing that way that hurt your defense. And while, yes, Clemson has gotten incredibly set up when they had, Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence and then DJ Uiagalelei going forward. And then you look at, Ohio State sort of being gifted Justin Fields in a way, gifted in the sense that he became available when he did. Because I do not think Ohio State has the season it has if it is playing Tate Martell or I believe Matthew Baldwin last season. So, and playing that game where you want that offense every sort of year, you need to hit the quarterback situation right. And you even look at Clemson, that I believe the 2017 team, they didn't have Lawrence. He wasn't there yet. They first year post Deshaun, and they had Kelly Bryant. And that year, it was just sort of a lost year because when you put so much on your offense and your offense being so great, like ultimately the reality is time and time again, I think you're going to come up a little short in that aspect. So, and ultimately, I think another thing to consider, if Monken does turn around this offense and make it look like I think everyone wants it to look like, he's probably not going to be here very long. If Georgia goes 12-0 and has the season that, I think every Georgia fan dreams of, and they're playing potentially in a college football playoff and a national title, given Monken's credentials and the fact that he's already been a college head coach, his ties to the NFL, it wouldn't surprise me if he's sort of, and again, we were saying the same sort of things about James Coley a year ago. It wouldn't surprise me if Monken ends up being sort of a one-and-done type guy if everything goes well for Georgia. Ultimately, I believe he's got a 3-year contract here with Georgia. So I think the big thing with Monken is, ultimately, if he sticks around for year 2, I think perhaps a little bit more interested in what that looks like. And yeah, Christopher White brings up 15. If it's 15-0 pie in the sky, Monken's probably not here for year 2. He's probably coaching somewhere else. And that's ultimately that's a very nice problem to have if you're Georgia. But I think, and I'll be interested to see, the biggest thing for me this season when it comes to offense is, And yeah, Desmond Lane brings up, Georgia going up tempo and more no huddle. I think that goes hand in hand with how much does I think Kirby sort of loosen up on the steering wheel a little bit. I think he, as much as, James Coley had his struggles last season, I think that ultimately, part of this blame has to Kathy Aquaviva. Good to see you. The blame on this offense, it falls in the seat or in the lap of Kirby Smart. And what does he do as a coach? Because again, and he'll be the first to tell you, he's not some offensive guru. He's a great defensive mind, perhaps the best in college football. But the reality is, offense isn't his forte. And until he sort of gets that figured out, you're going to see teams be and national media pundits, we all know who they are, be very hard on Smart, harder even than they are, I think, on Lincoln Riley when it comes to the defensive side of the ball and sort of the struggles that Oklahoma continues to have there. I don't, for a variety of reasons, you don't see the same type of criticism, I think, leveled at Lincoln Riley that you do at Kirby Smart. And part of that is, Kirby was brought in to win titles and you move on from Mark Richt. And Oklahoma has ostensibly the same goals that Georgia has every single year. Beat your big rival, which Oklahoma is Texas, Georgia is Florida, win your division or in the Big 12, come in first and second, win your conference, play for a college football playoff game, win a national title. Essentially, those two schools have the exact same goals. They're going about it, I think, in different ways. Georgia very much leaning on defense and recruiting. Oklahoma very much more of an offensive-minded, I can design sort of any offense and get the most out of it and get my team into the playoffs. The other thing with Oklahoma, though, is that when they go play those big SEC teams, the teams that in the past 2 years have beaten Georgia in the SEC title game, they get their butt kicked more than Georgia does. Georgia has held their own a little bit better against Alabama and LSU last year, in the last 2 years, than Oklahoma did when Oklahoma got a crack at them. So, what does that sort of mean and say for them? I think Georgia and Oklahoma right now, they pretty clearly operate in the same tier of, and you can probably put LSU in there this year of, yes, they're going to be in it sort of every year, but they need a couple of things to go right, I think, to get in that truly elite tier that Ohio State, Clemson, and Alabama currently occupy. So, Desmond Lane brings up Oklahoma they have not won a playoff game yet. And other than the Georgia one, which they blew a 17.3 score lead, they have struggled in those games, and they have not been all that close. I mean, the last one against LSU was just an outright disaster. There's no if, ands, or but about it. You think you think to what Georgia sort of did against LSU and how ugly that game was, at least from an offensive side of the ball. What LSU did to Oklahoma was 1,000 times worse, in my opinion, than what happened with Georgia in that game. Georgia got LSU, I think, at the worst possible time, just given the injuries and depth situation at wide receiver. So, Chadwick Ivory, I think, really, really hits the button on sort of the offense. Just be less predictable, boring, and score more points. That's the reality is the Auburn game. Yes, Georgia was up 21-0 in that game, but you realize in that game, and Chase White, I like my setup. It's not a terrible setup. You look at that Auburn game. Georgia only got the ball inside Auburn's 43 times. Unfortunately, they turned all of those into touchdowns. Statistically, that's just not a model for success. They need to consistently do a better job of putting drives together and creating more scoring opportunities. Kathy Aquaviva, why is Florida getting so much love from analysts? Is Trask that good? He's that intriguing. He had a good year last year. I don't think any Georgia fan would deny that. He certainly exceeded expectations. The media, I think in general, and it's sort of because he is the opposite of Kirby Smart in that Mullen is very open. He's willing to joke, laugh, show some personality, whereas Kirby Smart is very much not that way with the media. Mullen is an offensive guy. The media tends to favor and trust offenses more than they do defenses. And, there is, I think, a fatigue factor when it comes to Georgia in the sense that, they win the SEC East every year, but they can't get it done against the Alabamas, against the big boys of the world. So I think, and as a media member myself, the reality is a lot of times we just want to look smart. We want to look smart. We want to, appear that we know more than we actually do. And the reality is, I think that's a big reason why teams look to pick analysts are looking to pick Florida and tout Florida, because at the end of the year, if Florida hits, they're going to be able to see, well, look, I knew all along. And, picking Georgia at this point is just not an attractive option. And Chadwick Ivory brings up, as wild as it is to say, this is, I do not think that Florida is on the same tier as the truly elite teams. I think Georgia is closer there. This is the best Florida team in a decade, or just about a decade. Maybe that 2000, I guess, 12 team that Georgia beat in Jacksonville, the Jarvis Jones stripping of Jordan Reed, excuse me. That just should not be the case at Florida. And so I definitely, I saw someone there saying Florida sells magazines. I think there's a lot of people that want Florida to be back. And because the idea of if Florida ever somehow becomes sort of a juggernaut under Dan Mullen, it sort of turns back into a Steve Spurrier situation, which I think could be sort of what a lot of people want to see. So, yeah, Travis McCullough, you bring up Felipe Franks. There were a lot of people touting Felipe Franks a year ago. Now, obviously, I think Trask had a better year than Franks did, and you probably trust Trask a little bit more than you do Franks. Clay Dykes brings up Florida's been a darling since Urban Meyer and Tim Tebow. So, Nick Schneiderman, you've not heard much about Trey McKitty. That's just because I think the Georgia fan base has now reached the point on tight ends where just don't talk about it anymore. Just show us. Just go out there and show that you're going to use tight ends. McKitty, I think he's got a little bit of a similar profile to what Lawrence Cager did a season ago. And yes, Jeff Ingram, Steve Ensminger is still technically the OC at LSU. Scott Linehan will be their passing quarter, sort of taking over the role that Joe Brady had a season ago. What was I just talking about? Trey McKitty. So, he comes in from Florida State and he didn't light the world on fire, but the reality is the college game with tight ends it's very different than how NFL teams use them, because for a lot of these teams, I think you have athletic mismatches all over the field, in the sense that, with teams like Georgia, when they go play Kentucky's, South Carolina's, Tennessee's, they just have better athletes than them. At the NFL level, that number is that gap is very much mitigated. And I think the tight end position, where you get a guy who is sort of big enough to be a capable blocker on the offensive line, but also athletic enough to be split out wide and be a great pass catcher, I think that's where sort of teams look for those advantages and those mismatches, where the reality is, like, as much as having a nice tight end, laugh there, please, as much as having a nice tight end in college is for you, you'd rather just take your chances throwing to George Pickens on the outside against some poor overmatched corner. And so I think that's sort of where, the reluctance to believe in and sort of think that a tight end is really going to do and change all that much. But I think McKitty I'll be interested to see with Monken what he does with him. He did some good things with O.J. Howard in Tampa Bay in his time there. And if he's another capable option, again, he's played big-time games. He's played at a Power 5 level. I think that's going to help Georgia. I think having that sort of experience, especially when there's so much new on this team and on these guys that have just not played a ton of football, having a guy like McKitty who's been through some wars, who's played in some big-time games against big-time teams, I think that can only really help. And, as far as numbers-wise, I'm not going to really make a prediction on what he'll do. But, you saw last year, Eli Wolf, when called upon, made some pretty big plays, and it wouldn't surprise me if Trey McKitty sort of does the same thing this season. So we are at the 33-minute mark. So final questions, final sort of comments, anything like that, get them in. Andrew Allgood asked about a field goal kicker situation. I think it's going to be Jake Camardo, or it's going to be Jared Zirkle, the incoming kicker from Texas, who will be a blue shirt to our knowledge. It'll be interesting. Camarda, I think he got a lot better as a punter last year, and he's going to be the punter again this year. Do you sort of add field goals to his plate? Zirkle is almost, I certainly believe, going to handle the sort of kickoff duties. But as Brandon Adams has mentioned so much, kicking in a high school stadium is very different, even in an empty college stadium, than kicking in Sanford Stadium. So we'll sort of see where things go there. It's between those two guys. Hopefully you don't know that answer. I think perhaps as great as Rodrigo Blankenship was in recent years, having him be so reliable, it sort of made it easy to be a little bit more conservative and just say, hey, we'll just take these 3 points here. Whereas, if you have a less certain kicker situation, perhaps you are a bit more aggressive in sort of hunting and looking for more touchdowns. And I think that is something that Georgia certainly needs to do. And just a way, if you turn one field goal into a touchdown every week, that's 4 extra points. That's huge for Georgia. That's going from averaging 30 points to 34.5 points. And that, I think, could end up making a big difference over the course of a season. You look at there are just countless examples of teams kicking field goals when they pretty clearly shouldn't. So aside from Bama, Nick Steinman asks, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Nick. Besides Bama, what's the toughest game of the season? Brandon Adams will almost certainly tell you Auburn. Mike Griffith will mention Tennessee, but then say, oh, they're all hype. But I think it's pretty clearly Florida. They are just, they're a good team. They're a top 10 and top 15 caliber team. Are they on the same tier as Georgia? I want to see it to believe it first. But that game, as great as these last couple of years have been, especially with Kirby and Mullen, I worry about that game. I was there in 2014. I was there in 2015 for the Vuitton Bauta game. I've just, my lifetime, and, some of the older people, they're old enough to remember when Georgia really ran this rivalry. And the reality is, in my lifetime, that has, up until these past couple of seasons, has just not been the case. So, it's just always sort of a game you worry about. It's always a game you sort of feel uneasy about in your stomach. And when you win, it's just fantastic. Like, it just does not matter how you win. It's just absolutely fantastic. So, let's see. Any final questions, comments? I saw a recruiting question. Justin Tell just put up a big story on Tony Grimes. It seems like I haven't had a full chance to read it yet, but based off what I know, he is not going to end up reclassifying. I think that is very, very, very good news for Georgia because playing time is something that is very important to Grimes. And I think the reality is that if he reclassifies and tries to join this 2020 class, he'd be competing with the guys like Stokes, Daniels, Campbell, Keely Ringo. But now if he's a 2021 guy, there's a good chance that Daniel will definitely be gone after the season. Mark Webb will definitely be gone after the season. But then guys like, Eric Stokes and Tyson Campbell are draft eligible guys. And if the Georgia defense has the season we think they have, there's a good chance those guys are gone next year in high draft picks in the NFL. And by high draft picks, I mean, second, third round, potentially first round. But those guys go on to be very good players. And Grimes should absolutely be seen as one of Georgia's top targets in this recruiting class, in this recruiting cycle, and just certainly given what they figure to be losing at the quarterback position. Philip Jordan was sour Skittles or regular? So I like sour to start. The problem is I have no impulse control, so I will eat the whole bag, and it just messes up my mouth. It messes up my tongue. It just messes the whole thing up. So I'd have to go just regular Skittles there. If it's a small pack of sour Skittles or regular Skittles, I'll take the sours. But the full pack you get at a grocery store, I can't do it. It messes up my mouth. Any idea how immediate it is? We'll look with it virtual. I imagine it's going to be a lot of Zoom calls. I'll be interested to see, they might stream some stuff through YouTube. They might, get creative with it. But from, the media access standpoint, I imagine it's just going to be a lot of Zoom calls and people sort of checking in and seeing if they can ask a question, sort of getting what they need to get. Clay Dyke's favorite. Oh, well, yes, I'm definitely a Sour Patch Kid. I will eat an entire bag of Sour Patch Kids. No reservations about that. Clay Dyke's favorite quarantine meal. I actually just made some really good stuffed peppers that I was particularly proud of. I made a baked ziti, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks ago. That is probably the best meal that I have made. So, I will answer food questions all day long. So, who's going to step up? And this is a great way to sort of tie it all back together. I think it's Azeez. I talked about sort of his need, and when I post this tomorrow, I'll sort of recap what I said about Azeez. I think he's the guy where if he makes the leap that I think he can and will make, he's the guy who gets 9, 10 sacks and sort of becomes sort of that, maybe not Jarvis Jones type, but a guy who can single-handedly wreck a drive and potentially even wreck a game. And I think that's sort of where they are there. Did Munden push? So the thing with Smail Munden is he said in June, and I believe today is June 16th. So we're about halfway through the month. There's been some talk he might delay it. He never officially said an official commitment date. So, who knows when that will actually come. All right. We've got about 40 minutes here. This was, all right. Last question, James Mo. Do you think we get Mason Smith or Foreman or both? Right now, I would say neither. Just given, I don't know when visits are going to open up. I don't know when players are going to be back on campus. If I had to pick one that I feel more comfortable with, I would probably lean Foreman. It sounds like, and given the fact that he committed to Clemson, it sounds like he's open to the fact of leaving California. Whereas Mason Smith, the recent history of LSU missing out on 5-star players is just not there. And I think the thing with Foreman is, USC, while yes, they could be very good this year, I think that game against Bama is going to be a little bit more interesting than a lot of people think. But there's also, and they return a lot, obviously, but there's also a chance where things don't go well this year. And the fan base a year ago, they were ready to fire Clay Helton. And if things start going south really quickly, I could almost certainly see that happening. And if that happens, I think that helps out Georgia's chances a good bit landing Mr. Foreman. So with that, Clay Dykes, Desmond Lee, Philip Jordan Wells, Rodney Hewitt, great seeing you guys. Great talking with you guys. Tomorrow, you've got Before the Hedges. Jeff Santel, 6 o'clock. Tune in that. He always has great recruiting intel and is much better at this than I am. I'm pretty sure we're going to end up doing a cover 4 on Thursday, 3 p.m. Those are always usually a lot of fun. BA, Jeff, myself, Mike Griffith always have good back and forth there. Obviously, Dog Nation Daily every Monday through Friday. One last thing for me. If you go to the Dog Nation website, you will see a sort of thing at the top of our page for a Kroger giveaway. Is a chance to win a Gas Grill $50 gift card. But I think the thing that I'm more interested in is all you have to do is sort of share a photo, a video, a moment, a memory with your dad that involves Georgia football. I'm a sucker for stuff like this. I can tell you when I was out covering the Dylan Fairchild announcement a few weeks ago, it was really cool just talking with and chatting with his dad and seeing how happy he was with everything. So I thought that was a really cool moment. So do me a favor. If you go to Dog Nation, you see that Kroger giveaway at the top of our page. Click on it, enter it, submit it. You got a chance to win a grill. You got a chance to win a $50 gift card from there. You will not regret it. And really, it's just a cool way to honor your dad with Father's Day being this coming Saturday. So it's great seeing you guys. Have a good night.